Tinach, Tanoia, Chin con mantomi, un hack un squallowin, kun sque con snatch no me. It brings such good feelings to my heart to be welcoming you here this evening. Carolyn Roberts, Quinnen Sna, Tinachta Telas Kohomish Okameach, Nakaka Okameach, and Shiakton Okameach. In my ancestral language of the Skohomish people, I said, "Good evening." and hak and squallowin quinswe quinsnach nomi means it brings good feelings to my heart to see all of you here this evening. And welcome to the territories of the Skohomish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Homaquim peoples. My name is Carolyn Roberts. I am Statlium from the Naquaqua Nation, which is just up past Pemberton. My mother is Janet Baker, and we come from the Thafarge family up in that territory. On my father's side, I am a Kelly, and I'm a Stolo person from the Shiakton territory, which is out in the Chilliwack area. And this evening, we are on the territories of the Skohomish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Homaquim peoples, and I am a Squamish Nation member as well. The Skohomish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people have been living with and on this land for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They've nurtured it and taken care of it in order for all of us to be here this morning. Along the waterways and the lands were our village sites that lined these waterways, and the land was optimal for hunting and fishing, gathering fruits and berries, and also medicinal plants. In the Nataquiquaquank, in the long, long ago, our elders would say, when the tide goes out, the table is set, because, right? We had everything that we needed from this land. It nourished us and supported us as stomos, as humans, and sustained our way of life for over 20,000 years upon this land. One of our village sites, the village of Kwai Kwai, colonially known today as Stanley Park, and Lumberman's Arch. The village of Kwai Kwai was from one of our late Skohomish chiefs, Chief Hatsalano. His family lived there, and they had a longhouse that was on that location. And the last potlatch that was held in that territory was in the mid-1880s, just before the potlatch ban. And there was over 2,000 people that came from all the way down from California to all the way up to Alaska and all over the islands and the territories here. They came to celebrate who we were as people. And in our culture, in our traditions, our potlatch traditions, we were so wealthy. And wealthy meant that we had family, and lots of family meant we were really rich, and also really rich for what we could give away. And that meant that we were very rich if we had things to give to everybody who came to the potlatch. So you would never leave with a hungry belly or empty hands. We always took care of you when you were on these particular territories. And today, as we were talking in the back, the Skohomish people are revitalizing our languages, working really hard to make sure that our Munmun, our next generation, have the language to take with them for the next generations to come. We're also rebuilding our culture and our traditions in hopes that we can also pass those on to the next generation. And we are also reclaiming land that was stolen from us. And we now have our land back at the Sanok village, where some new buildings are being put up. So it is a great pleasure and a great honor to welcome you all here this evening. And I also get to introduce these lovely people on the stage, except no one told me your name. Sarah, thank you. Sarah's behind me. So we're here this evening to talk about Wob's new book. And I got to tell you, when I read Moon of the Crusted Snow, the first one, totally unsettled. I was totally like, I couldn't put it down because I needed to know what happened. So I read it and I read it and I read it really fast. And I can see why people put those seeds in your brain to say, no, you need to write another one as a follow-up. And I'm so thankful that you let them flourish and grow into this new, beautiful book that you've written. And I read the next one, Moon of the Turning Leaves. Same thing, totally unsettled. And I couldn't put it down because I had to know what happened, right? For those of you who've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. And I think it's because you're such a beautiful storyteller by inviting us to be a part of the story. We're not observers of it. We're actually there with them. Mm-hmm. Why I was unsettled. Right? So I'm so thankful for that. And you have this masterful way of weaving in Anishinaabe culture and traditions in the story and not shying away from the colonial harm that has also happened to us as Indigenous people. You are just such a masterful teacher. And my hands are raised in deep gratitude for you sharing your stories with us this evening. So thank you. And before we start, in Coast Salish traditions, my grandmother was one of the ladies who started to revitalize Coast Salish weaving. And I'm a baby weaver. So no, I am. I'm a baby weaver. So I would like to gift this to you as in our culture and tradition to keep you safe and warm and safe in your travels. So thank you. Thank you. So without further ado, Sarah, Waub, and Darrel. Hoichach. Thank you, friends.
Darrel J. McLeod is Siegaso, Waheo Tsinia, Amisquachi Waskahigano Tsinia. So I'm Darrel McLeod, and I just introduced myself in my language, which is Nehia or Cree, which is related to Waub's language. We're based on Algonquin languages, and the two languages have a lot in common. And it gives me great pleasure to be here tonight. This is the highlight. I've been on a bit of a tour as well, and tonight is the absolute highlight for me, having time here with my good friend Waub. I want to call him brother or cousin, but maybe nephew would be a bit more appropriate. I've got to be more realistic these days. But it truly is an honor and a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for coming out on a weeknight, on a rainy night, a little bit chilly. So thanks for joining us. Kinanas kometen.
Oh, miigwech and chimigwech, Carolyn, thank you very much for that wonderful opening. Chimigwech Darrel, my brother, for hosting tonight. Big thanks to the Vancouver Writers Festival, Iron Dog Books, and the Real Vancouver Writers Series for making it all happen. Big round of applause for all those great entities, please.
Yeah. So, Waub, as I say, I've been worked up about this interview for some time, and I had a dream about it last night.
Oh, wow.
And the dream was that I misplaced my list of questions, so I had to wing it.
That's like a journalist dream, like a nightmare, right?
But it turned out well. And other parts of the dream kind of lead to the first question. And in another part of the dream, it was just lovely that you or I were in some kind of a writer's retreat or a writer's event for a week or so in some beautiful rural setting. And there were a bunch of other writers there with us, all Indigenous writers.
Oh.
And we were having such a great time. It was a really amazing experience. So my first question for you is, who would you invite?
Oh, that's like asking who like your favorite writer is, and it's just impossible to answer. I'd invite everybody, you know, it'd be like a gathering of nations of sorts, you know?
Yeah, good. Well, yeah, I would help you compose the list.
Yeah, for sure. Well, okay, I'll give a few shout outs. Connor Kerr from Edmonton, Métis. Jordan Abel, of course, too.
Yeah.
Katharina Vermette, Tiffany Morris. Just long list of people doing exciting things right now, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the list of new and established Indigenous authors out there is phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And, I was talking to some friends the other day, friends around my age, maybe a bit younger, and we were all Indigenous folks, and we were sitting around saying, geez, wouldn't it have been amazing if there had been writers like Wob when we were kids? And we got to read books like The Moon of Crusted Snow and Moon of Turning Leaves when we were kids. And all of the other books that are out there right now, Eden Robinson's books, I mean, are such a treasure and so rich. And I mean, Johnny Appleseed is a wild and a book that I wish I had been able to read in my youth.
Oh, yeah.
And Billy Ray Belcourt is writing amazing stuff, poetry and novels. And, you know, it's endless, isn't it? The types of literature that's coming out, poetry, novels. I think we're inventing our own genre, actually.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing because you see that influence really grow exponentially, right? And the wider the circle becomes, the more people come in to widen it further, you know? And I think back to when I was a teenager, you know, back in the 90s, not even knowing that Indigenous authors existed, you know, because going to high school in Ontario back then, it was only white dudes in the curriculum, right? So fortunately, when an auntie of mine was a teacher on the res school when I was a kid, and I went to high school officer of like all the kids on our res. But she always checked in on us when we were in high school just to see how things were going. And I remember one time when I was in about grade 11, she just asked me at a family function how school was going. And I said, oh, it's going pretty well. And, you know, I'm getting good marks. And she said, well, it's your best mark. And I said, oh, it's English class. And she said, oh, yeah, what do you like about English? And I said, well, I just like reading the novels and doing the writing assignments and all that. And she said, oh, yeah, well, what novels do you reading? Like what authors? And I was like, oh, you know, like Shakespeare and J.D. Salinger and W.O. Mitchell and Sir William Golding and a long list of white dudes, the aforementioned white dudes, right? So my auntie just kind of went, oh, yeah, like that. And then just kind of left it. She didn't say anything after that, right? But it was after that she started giving me books by Indigenous authors for my birthday or for Christmas, you know, like Richard Waubgeshig, Lee Maracle, Maria Campbell, Louise Erdrich, Richard Van Camp, you know, all these, Jordan Wheeler, all these people who were writing books in the 90s who I had no idea existed because it wasn't coming through to me through the education system, right? So that's what really opened my eyes. And it was life-changing, you know, and it was affirming in so many ways to finally see, you know, representation in a printed format, you know, in this medium that I had grown to love, the novel, you know. So to know that kids these days can read you and they can read everybody else that you mentioned and even my books, like what an honor that is. It's it only improves, and I believe it's exponential too, as I said. So
I agree. It absolutely is exponential, and thankfully.
Yeah.
So Wob, this is, I don't know what interview number this would be for you in the last couple of months, but I know you've been interviewed by some amazing people and you have a couple more coming still. Like tomorrow night in Victoria, I think you're being interviewed by the amazing Sheila Rogers.
Yeah.
Isn't that great? She's wonderful.
I know, she's the best. Yeah.
So I know you've been interviewed by brilliant people who've come up with phenomenal questions, I'm sure. They probably had a list. But what I'm wondering is something that I myself came up with as I was touring and being interviewed. And are there some questions that you anticipated and you were hoping people would ask that haven't been asked yet?
Oh, so far? No, I don't think so.
You've covered it all.
There are like some very Anishinaabe specific things in this new one that I'm waiting for, you know, some res people to hit on, but they're so specific that I don't expect anybody to. So we'll see. We'll see when that happens. But the book's only been out for a few weeks too, right? So
yeah. Well, you talk about the res people and the other Anishinaabe folks who I know are big fans. I have a lot of friends who, like you, are cousins, but Anishinaabe cousins. And I mean, you have a big following there, huge fans. And one of the things that really moved me so much about your book, I used our language, Nehiyaw or Cree, in my books for the titles, and I put some of the language in carefully, strategically, but interestingly didn't translate it. I was advised by a couple of editors and wise folks not to translate the Cree that I put in. But, you know, you've really moved the bar forward in your books because you've incorporated so much more of your language and it's stunningly beautiful. I mean, I just love the language so much. But I thought that was a really courageous move. And can you just talk a little bit about that, about how you used Anishinaabe in your book, and the decision making that went into that, and the care and thought that went into that?
Yeah, miigwech. Well, I'm not a fluent speaker. I have probably, a toddler's ability to express, and, on the comprehension side, a little bit better
And
than
are you
that.
as prolific as a toddler?
In terms of what, like making a mess or
Talking.
smashing things? I have a toddler at home, so he smashes everything, right? But it was really important for me to include it, mostly for the sake of representation, to have, our language in, an English text, to show that, it's still there, it's still being spoken. There are people working really hard to restore it, and that, it hasn't gone away despite all the brutality it's endured, the language itself. But it was really important for me not to misrepresent my own skill. So you'll see a difference if you're an Anishinaabe speaker between Moon of the Crusted Snow and Moon of the Turning Leaves. It's a little more advanced in the second one, just because I've improved my skills over the past 3 years, just thanks to courses I've been taking and so on. But it started in the first book with me really working hard to put it in there, mostly in dialogue. And what I did in the first draft was I would have a character speaking the language, Anishinaabe, and then they'd repeat the same thing in English right after. So they'd say like, Mudbin Mompi, and then they'd repeat it saying, sit down here, And Susan Renouf at ECW Press, who edited the first book, when I gave it to her, she said, you don't have to do that. You don't have to translate it every time. You can, translate it, quote unquote, in the action that follows, or other context, or even in the response of the other person in dialogue with that character, and so on. And she also said, you don't have to do anything if you don't want to, like you don't have to hold the reader's hand through it all. Being a reader is being challenged in many ways too. And that was so empowering, a white woman in her 60s from Toronto telling me to be proud of my language, right? And I thought it would be the opposite experience. It was my first experience with, a non-Indigenous publisher. And I was like, well, they're probably going to want to scrub it all, but we'll just see what happens. And it was the total opposite. She was so kind and so generous with her read of the Anishinaabe one that, I felt like really proud to have it in that first book. So with Moon of the Turning Leaves, a different publisher, different editor, Rick Meyer. And when we started it out, I said, well, with Anishinaabe one's really important to me. It's got to be in the book. This is how I did it with Susan, and this is how we're going to do it now. Just said, we're not going to, scrub it or anything like that. And he was obviously totally supportive of it too. And he let the language breathe and live in there. And I'm pretty happy with how it, exists in the story. And, to me, it's not about like beating anybody over the head with it. It's just allowing it to be there and being proud of it at the same time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. One of the, I had personal moments of joy reading your book with the language, because, like I said, Cree and Anishinaabe, Nehiyaw and Anishinaabe are quite related.
Yeah.
And there were moments when I recognized words like minikwe, which means drink, and shomish, our word for mushum or grandfather is mushum. And there were many times like that, and I just made my heart beat a little bit faster.
Cool.
It's fun to see it in print.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still a novelty for me, right? So, I had this moment after I finished my book and it was out in print and saw it, and that never gets old. It's such a thrill to see your book in print. And I was going to be interviewed by the amazing Sheila Rogers for my launch here in Vancouver, and I thought, I damn well better know my book inside out. Because I don't know if this happened to you, but in the process of writing, so much you put so much in and so much goes out, and then you bring some in and then you take some out, and, by the end, you just don't remember what all, it's 350 pages, for God's sake.
Yeah.
But, so I sat with my book for 2 days. I just sat down and read my own book for 2 days, and what joy that brought me, fortunately.
Yeah.
But I just wondered what have been the great moments of joy for you with either book, but maybe particularly the last one, because you've had time to talk about the first one. But for this last one, what have been some of the great moments of joy for you?
Just this one now that's out? Oh, just having it's just out in the world, being here with you all. It is a huge privilege and an honor just to have these opportunities. And it really means a lot to me, especially that you come out on a rainy night. And I recognize that, there are a lot of rainy nights in Vancouver. Like where I'm from in Sudbury, if it snows or it rains, nobody's going out to anything, right? So, but yeah, it's just so rewarding and so humbling to be able to do this. So I'm still like, it hasn't really sunk in yet because the book came out and then I was on the road right away, right? Maybe when the royalty check comes in, that'll be a little more real. We'll see, but yeah, it's just so wonderful to have these opportunities, and I'm very thankful.
All right, good. Yeah, well, I'm excited about your first royalty check too.
Yeah.
Good for you. You'll have to send me a photo of it. I'm fascinated by the names of your characters because you used a lot of Anishinaabe names too, I think. How did you go about selecting names for your characters, and how did you feel about how things ended up?
Yeah, I wanted to show the intergenerational differences because that exists in my community. It probably does in yours too, with your like younger family members being probably named more in Cree, Nehioan. So yeah, that happened, and it happens in my community too. I have the name Waubgeshig, and I've had it from birth. It's my legal name. And being born in 1979, it wasn't like outright unusual, but it definitely wasn't as common as it is today. So, my father's Anishinaabe and my mother's Canadian. So on my father's side, all of his siblings have English or Christian names, whatever you want to call it. And the older generations had Anishinaabe names, but they stopped using them, right? And only used their English names. So it's an act of reclamation and resurgence in my opinion. And seeing that happen actually in my community, I wanted to show that in this community as well. So the Evan and Nicole, the two main parents are obviously have I guess English names, but their kids, Maingun and Nungos, have Anishinaabe names, and a lot of the other younger characters do as well. So yeah, that's one of, I think, the greatest acts you can do of restoration and renewal is naming the next generation in the language of your people. When it happened, since time immemorial and was severed, by colonialism within the last couple of generations, right? So yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to show, and with to add to the language element, because this community at this point in their history, they've been liberated thanks to this cataclysm and can freely return to their land and restore their practices. Their language gets a bit of a boost too, because they're not hindered by the bureaucracy or the shame that still exists in mainstream dominant culture and all that. So yeah, having a name, I think, is like an essential first step in doing that restoration work.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks for that. I'm going to move to a slightly different topic now. Doing this kind of role, and also I get asked to write blurbs for books as well as interview authors from time. And this is something kind of new for me, and it's all fun and it's great. And I get free books. I get to read amazing authors. So the last author before you was Katrina Vermette.
Oh, yeah.
Her book, The Circle. And so I read her book, and then on the heels of that, I read yours. And I said earlier that I really do believe that we're developing a new genre. I think, and it won't be that long. I think in 5 or 10 years, maybe people will start to recognize that there really is an Indigenous genre. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean just with Indigenous writers in English in Canada, also in the Americas and in other countries where there are strong Indigenous populations. There's this, what I call, some people call it a renaissance, I call it a revolution. But I think we really are developing a new genre. And so I see techniques like with Katrina Vermette, Kate, and with you, and with a new young Heldsick author I just read to write a blurb for Brandon Reed. I scrambled to figure out what the technique was that we were using. So I went to some of my books, my collection on writing, some of the experts, and I went to one of the early ones, E.M. Forster, The Aspects of the Novel. And he opens his book by saying that storytelling is atavistic, meaning that it takes us right back to our ancestral roots. And, I think we see that. We do see that powerfully, and it's a powerful example in your book. And I'm just really curious about how you came to be a storyteller.
Oh, thanks. Well, I grew up in the 80s when, at a time when our community was working really hard to revive culture, and there were some really difficult times over the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, with a lot of premature death, due to, homicide, suicide, substance use, and so on, right? And my parents' generation, towards the end of the 70s, had really had enough. They were devastated, just quite generally, and they wanted to find a way to sort of break that cycle. And they turned back to the culture. They brought ceremonies back, they brought drums back, because all the drums that were in our community were confiscated and destroyed by the Indian agent, decades prior, right? So they had to learn how to drum again and how to make drums and all that. But it was
because, sorry for interrupting, it was because ceremonial practices were outlawed.
Yeah, they were outlawed by the Indian Act. It was illegal, and like sweat lodges, all that. You'd be arrested or fined or anything like that, right? So when I was a kid in the 80s, all these things started coming back, and I had like a front row seat to that revival, that revolution that you say. So that was really empowering for me to just witness as a little kid, because I, was learning about being Anishinaabe, and I saw my dad finally being proud to be Anishinaabe and explore those elements that he had been denied for basically his entire life up to that point. And the storytelling part was a really crucial component to that. And we were really lucky that we had our elementary school on the res, and there was that educational sovereignty to do what we wanted within our own education system. And that involved bringing in elders to share stories with us, not just like the trickster stories, who's Nanabush in our culture, or the creation stories, but also like the community history, the regional history, the family histories, and so on, because people were shamed out of knowing those things, right? So finally they were empowered to share these things with us once again. So I recognize the importance of storytelling from a very young age, fortunately, right? And I don't know if I saw like the straight line to the careers that I ended up in, either journalism or literature, from there, but it just laid that foundation for me, I think. And I think it just really instilled that respect in me for that practice and for the people that held on to this knowledge despite everything they endured, So I just saw it as my responsibility to do what I could to uphold that practice and just see, once I got into journalism and started, trying to be a fiction writer, seeing where I could take those to that level, I guess.
So while we were talking a bit about your family earlier, and you have 3 kids, and your oldest is 9, I think, right?
Almost 7.
Almost 7, pardon me. Yeah. So do you tell your kids bedtime stories?
Yeah. But the cool thing is like, we get them to make up their own stories.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Which is, and actually my wife just sent me a recording from bedtime tonight. So since I've been on the road, she's been doing that, and it's been pretty cool, But yeah, it's just like we try to, promote their own imagination and get them to recite these things back and forth to us. And it's just really cool to see that development happen.
Yeah,
they're the storytellers. They tell us stories.
Oh, that's amazing.
And they're like totally bizarre stories, right? Because they're little kids, So it's trippy.
Yeah, I bet that's intriguing. So I sense a new generation of storytellers coming forward.
Well, yeah, and that storytelling manifests itself in so many different things, right? It doesn't have to just be writing a book or writing a screenplay or a play or anything like that. like our practice of storytelling is not just sitting in a circle and learning from an elder or another knowledge keeper. Like the storytelling happens when you're out in the bush harvesting sumac or dandelions with your auntie or your grandma, and she's telling you the stories as to why you do that and the origin of those plants and what it can do. And it's a shoulder to shoulder thing too, not just a circle thing or anything else like that. So like the storytelling is embedded in all of that revolution, as you say, you know, so it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah. Well, I just want to linger on that theme for a minute longer. In your family or your circle, your community, can you think of other than yourself, some amazing storytellers that may have influenced you, who may have influenced you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like my dad, he's got tons of stories. Yeah. Which is great, you know, so we get our kids together with him a lot, but like everybody in my community, really, you know, and I think once they were liberated back in that era of the 80s to do that, I think it just really blossomed, and it was really cool to see. And I think the time was set aside for all of that, as I mentioned, like in our school, but otherwise every other sort of community gathering, you know, so yeah, I think inherently everybody's a storyteller, no matter what your background is. It's how we entertained ourselves for, you know, millennia around the fire, and so on. And I think, you know, we all can really tap into that if, you know, we're able to, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a great answer. Thank you. It's very similar in my community.
Yeah.
Except one thing, I worked in northern British Columbia for a while and in a First Nations community too as a school principal. And I realized that my people, the Nehiawak, have something in common with the Duck Health people I was working with. And that's, we like to tell tall tales or have bullshit contests. Do you guys have bullshit?
Oh yeah,
contests?
there's a lot of bullshit, like big time. But that's the thing, like they keep you on your toes, right? And I think maybe that instills some critical thinking at a young age too, you know. So
wow, that's the most diplomatic answer I've ever heard. It's like I have a good Anishinaabe friend who I won't mention her name, but she's a high-level social work professor, and so was her ex-husband. And she told me once that the evening before they had some dynamic discourse. And I said, "Oh, so you're arguing?" But yeah, that was a very diplomatic way of putting that. I like that. So I'm going to get a bit technical for a minute. Back to E.M. Forster, because I really love studying technique. And, you know, I heard, who was it, on a panel last week in Ottawa that you heard for a while. I think it was Katharina. Yeah, it was Katharina Vermette, who has a master MFA in creative writing. Mm-hmm. So she knows the skill and the art, the craft. And I asked her about her the editing process that she went through. You talked a little bit about yours, which sounds like it worked out quite well. And she said for the most part, hers was good. But when it came to the technical edit or the copy edit, that was where things got a little bit testy. Because she has an MFA, she knows grammar, she knows punctuation, and she said, you got to know the rules if you're going to break them, and break them masterfully. And so one of the aspects of the novel that really interests me is the relationship between plot and character. And I was just curious if you had given that any thought in your books about the importance of plot versus character, because E.M. Forster says that there's a real dynamic relationship between them, and that one kind of, if you spend more time on character, you're going to have less time for plot. If your book is heavy on plot, you have less time for character development. So had you thought about that at all, and balancing those things in your books?
Yeah. And I should say, you know, like I don't have a literary background. You know, I don't know like most of the technical.
It don't matter.
Well, the thing is, like, I have a journalism degree, right? So I know best how to.
Whatever, you're brilliant, man.
Well, how to not get sued is like probably the extent of my expertise there, right? But no, like having, you know, read a lot, you know, you hopefully pick up some things here and there. But in terms of that particular question, yeah, that was actually something that came up when Rick and I were were going through the editing process. And it was always really important for me to humanize Anishinaabe people, you know, in both of these books and in my previous 2 books too, because I felt like fiction at this point in my career or in my life was a more effective way to humanize or contextualize everyday Indigenous people and communities more so than journalism, like just in my opinion as to where I was, right? Because there are some really nuanced, intimate moments you can get at in fiction, you know, that really help connect not just Indigenous people, but everybody else to that human moment, you know? So, you know, with this book in particular, it's a quest story. It's about moving through the lands after the end of the world and rediscovering it and then coming upon various threats and so on. So there were times when Rick and I were working through it that, you know, he was really focused on the pace of the plot, right? On making sure things moved in a good way, because, you know, walking through the bush over the course of a summer doesn't really sound like an exciting story, right? So there are things that have to happen along the way to make it a little more intriguing. But there are moments that I wanted to have in there to really humanize the characters, you know, to show them as authentically Anishinaabe as possible. And there's one point in the story, I think we barely, we didn't butt heads at all over anything. We had like some difference of opinions on certain parts, but one part in particular was there's a really traumatic event that happens about halfway through, and then the story kind of accelerates from there. But there's a moment I really wanted to have after that traumatic moment, and he said, you know, let's just lose that, because we got to keep going. We got to keep them moving. And I really wanted to have that there. And it's like this intimate moment between the father and the daughter where they're braiding each other's hair, right? And that's like a moment of healing, you know, like I've been in those situations after some traumas and tragedies where those are the things that just, you know, just reconnect you with your people, your family, yourself. And it was really essential for me to have that in there. And yeah, he was totally fine with it in the end. He really liked it, but it's those things, right? Those are the character elements I really wanted to maintain while trying to advance the plot throughout this quest story, right? So yeah, it was something we dealt with absolutely on an editorial level.
Thank you. There's some scenes of violence. It's not there's not a huge amount of violence, but there are some intense scenes of violence. And how was it for you to write those scenes? What was it like for you? I was really curious about that, because I haven't yet written scenes like that yet. So really curious.
Well, kind of cathartic in some ways, right? Even though like I would never act upon, you know, violence moments like that myself. But, you know, when you're dealing with shitty dudes and you want them to have their just outcomes, and, you know, it's very cathartic, as I said. But yeah, like the violent moments, I felt like if I was being as vivid as possible with describing the landscape or the intimacy between the characters or whatever else, and I owed it to the story to be as vivid with the violence too. So yeah, like a couple of those moments are pretty graphic, but I think they're necessary for how they show up in the story in those parts that they do. And yeah, it's, you know, kind of gory in some ways, but you know, you can just flip the page if you see it coming, right? And you don't want to read it. But
Yeah. Well, there's another expert on writing whose book I read lately, and you may have looked at it too, Stephen King's book on writing. And he says that, you know, when you're laying track, what I call laying track, when you're doing the first draft, the very first draft, your job is to get the story down on paper. And then he described the editing process very simply too. And the job in editing is to take out everything that isn't a part of the story, that doesn't really connect with the story. So I'm really interested about the first part of that for you. Like when you're doing the first draft, like how does your muse work? What's Waub's muse like?
Yeah, I think it was exactly that. Just trying to get it out and get it down, you know? I imagine the story from start to finish before I write anything. Okay. So I feel like I want to dream it up. recite it to myself, like internally, so that I could recite it to somebody else verbally, from start to finish. Not like how I would write it, but just, the sequence of events and so on, right? And so I feel like committing that to memory really helps me tap into the essence of the story and really know how it should flow and work in I guess, a natural way, right? But, writing it all out is a totally different story. So the first draft, I think, was something like 123,000 words. So if you think it's boring now, then holy shit, it was super boring that first draft, But it was like, it was just removing those extraneous things, the things that slowed it down. But because pacing was like the main objective that Rick and I had, in that revision process. There were like entire chapters that we cut for sure.
Wow.
Yeah. And like, it's such a great learning experience too, because there was one chapter early on, like the original chapter 3 was, I don't know how many pages, but he's like, yeah, you can probably like summarize that in 2 sentences. So I was like, okay, that sounds good. So we cut that whole chapter, and I could point it out to you if you ask me, like where that chapter ends up in just 2 sentences, right? So.
Well, I heard you talking with Margaret Gallagher on North by Northwest. I think you were interviewed about a week ago, but she actually played it this Saturday. And you covered a lot of ground there that I thought was really interesting, that about your process, and you didn't really get into much about the editing, but just talking about your general process of editing and how the characters ended up being the way they are. I'm really curious about the final stages, because the final stages are so dramatic. So, I mean, at least the way it worked for me. So you get it. A lot of people may not know this, but you go through a content edit, which can be quick, or it can take months. Mm-hmm. Then you go through a copy edit, which can also be quick, but it can take weeks. Mm-hmm. And then the author you get the final draft, right? Yeah. And you have the actual final word. Mm-hmm. So what was it like when the final draft landed on your desk?
Oh, it was a relief for sure. I was really fortunate that this was like my full-time work for a few years. I quit my job at CBC in the spring of 2020, and that's when I started working on this. And it really was, a developmental process with Rick the whole way through. We talked it out, and he said, okay, write it now. And then I wrote that first draft, and then he edited it and so on. It felt very natural how that editing worked. And then when I got that final like PDF file, it was pretty easy to go through, The copy edit was really interesting too, because it's a whole other set of eyes, looking at it in more of a technical way, as you mentioned, but also, she was the only other person other than Rick who'd seen it. So his view of the story was kind of like biased and skewed towards mine too. So on a technical level, like I had to like literally draw a map for her of like where everything happened and where they were going and everything like that, which was kind of fun too, So so every step of the way was really interesting. But yeah, it was a relief to get to that point. And that was like back in the early spring when we finally signed off on this. So I had the whole summer like not to think about it or anything. Right. So having it out was another like big moment of joy for sure.
Right. In that same interview with Margaret Gallagher, which aired Saturday, but it'll be up on the website now if any of you missed it. It's a really intriguing interview. But she asked you if this is going to go from having a sequel to becoming a triptych. Will there be a third book? And you said likely not. You want to move maybe in a while. I think you kind of ducked the question a little bit. You said maybe in a while, but you need a break from the dystopian kind of context. So do you have a project on the go right now? Can you talk about what might come next? Yeah,
a little bit. I want to do sort of a day in the life of a res on the day of a big bingo jackpot, just a couple of weeks before Christmas. Yeah. It's just hopefully going to be a multi-perspective thing of why everybody wants to win this jackpot before Christmas, and just show the characters that are on the res. So I'm only really just dreaming it up now, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, I won't rule out a part 3 of this because I did before, and like here we are talking about part 2. So, but yeah, maybe someday, I have a couple of ideas of where this could go, but I'm not thinking hard about it yet.
Let me give you a chance to ask some questions. I mean, I have more. I could talk to Wab for hours yet.
I was very curious around how come you didn't voice your audiobooks?
Oh, good question. I guess the simplest answer is that I was sick of looking at it by that point. I didn't want to read those words again because I had so many times. But it was like just really cool and special to have Billy be able to do it. He did Moon of the Crusted Snow. And when they started that process, they gave me a list of actors and said, who would you like to read it? And he was my first choice right away, just because, like we know Billy, like we've seen him on screen and on stage for decades now. He's just a legendary actor. So it's like, wow, Billy Morasti could do my audiobook. That would be awesome. And he did, and he like totally like, it's just so special to have what he created out there because, he really breathed a new life into the story and took it to a place that I never could have imagined, just how he delivered it and how he really connected with it too. And so when the audiobook for the second one came up, I said, I definitely want him back, and they were on board with that too. So yeah, it was really, just an easy next step for him to do it. But yeah, to answer your question, why not have a professional actor, do a dramatic reading of it. And yeah, I just love what he's done.
Well, you make me want to pick up the audiobook now and have a listen to that too. It sounds amazing because he really, truly is a talented actor.
Yeah. He's
great
so
voice,
awesome.
great
so
interpretation.
Awesome.
First of all, like this feels so unreal that I'm here. I'm also an English teacher. And I'm teaching your book for the second year in a row to the new course that our province has started, English First Peoples 10. And I can tell you that hundreds and hundreds of students have read your book, and they have loved the characters, even the bad guys. And, some of them they just can't get the characters out of their head. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
And my question to you is, as a female reader as well, like when I see the parts that you have written, the prologue in the second book, as well as like Nicole's perspective, like I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like as a mom of young kids, of spending time with them, like during the pandemic, as well as just raising kids. And as a male writer, like how did you get into that point of view, that perspective, and the birth scene too? Like, as like somebody who's given birth, I'm like, how can a writer like really be so great at understanding those details? So I just wanted to say thank you for that. And when I read your book, I also thought I need to have everything ready in terms of like if something goes down, I need to be ready for that. So yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, on that last part, I'm probably not ready either. I'd be doomed if this really happened in real life too. So don't take my word for anything. But with the birth scene, I wanted to start it that way, mostly because in the first book, there's just so much death, right? And there's so much despair, although there is these hopeful undertones and there is this theme of renewal, right? But I felt like to really get to that in the second book, I had to start it with a birth, to show that renewal, to show that regeneration, essentially, of these Anishinaabeg in their new home that they've created themselves, right? So that was always my intention. And, luckily, I witnessed a birth around the same time. My second son was born in June of 2020. So, that was very fresh, even though I wasn't the one delivering him, obviously. But I was a witness to that, right? And that was just so special to be able to experience that also within those early months of the pandemic, which were really hard, I think, for everybody. So that's the main reason why I wanted to start that, but also started that way, but also just to give a shout out to this wider movement of Indigenous midwifery that's happening. I had this conversation with my grandmother a while back, I think when my first son was born, and we're just talking about, birth and so on. And she said, yeah, when I was a kid, everybody was born here. Everybody was born at home, and then they would make the women give birth either in Parry Sound or in Toronto. I was born in Toronto, right, for medical reasons. And she said, I think, if we're really going to be Anishinaabe again, we're going to need to have births in the community. So we're seeing that nowadays. We're seeing the Anishinaabe midwives, empowering women to give birth at home on the res, which is like hugely regenerative. It's awesome. So I wanted to pay homage to that movement too with the birth scene. And yeah, it was really I liked writing it because it's sort of nondescript and it's sort of otherworldly, and it sets up chapter 1 where we're seeing Nungos being reintroduced to her as like the main character in the story. And I chose her to be like the co-protagonist because I was always going to set it 10 years in the future too. And I wanted to do that to put the spotlight on the younger generation in the first book, just to see how they would grow up in this new era, liberated, as I mentioned before, and practicing their traditional ways of life now that there's nothing hindering them from that anymore, right? So the next generation would be, a little stronger with that land-based connection, but also culturally at the same time. And then, I was always going to make it this quest story. So like the first question I asked myself was like, okay, Evan's still here. He's going to be leading this quest and one of the kids is going to go with him. And the first thought, usually like the trope is, oh, it's going to be the son, right? Mayan gun. And, but then I thought about it and it's like, this like a father-son buddy adventure story is just so boring, I didn't want to do that at all. And I thought, well, I have 3 sons and, it's my responsibility to them to read like a strong female lead character, so that's when I started thinking more about making Nungos the main character. And in terms of point of view, it was really cool exploring that too with Rick, introducing her point of view earlier to show her perception of the world and so on. But yeah, like writing from the perspective of a 15-year-old girl as a guy in his 40s was pretty hard for sure. But I have a lot of like teenage nieces and cousins who I spend a lot of time with, and it's the way I see these young women really leading the way in our communities by like hunting and tanning hides and harvesting medicine and so on. It's like, well, yeah, that's the natural progression of our future, and that's like someone like Nungos is going to be totally out there, leading the way. So yeah, it's about just being inspired by the women in my community for sure. But thanks for that. Thanks for that question.
I first read Legacy in, I think, 2014 came out.
Oh, yeah.
And
cool. Thanks.
what was so exciting was seeing Algoma landscape told in a story. And I'm just wondering how much in your writing process, the landscape, I know your titles of Moon on the Crusted Snow, and but how much in your writing process does going back to the landscape and to the land of Algoma and the region impact, or I guess influence, like where you take a story or start a story? Oh,
that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. It's huge. I'm really proud to be Anishinaabe from the North Shore of Lake Huron. My wife's family is from Bawating, from Garden River. So I spend a lot of time just going back and forth on the North Shore. So just being there, I think, is the biggest source of like primary inspiration, I guess, being on the land, on the water, and so on. And writing this book, especially, I would take moments where I would just go out and walk in the bush, because like that's the main action in the story, right? Is I'm walking through the bush over the course of the summer. So I would get out and, you know, either in Sudbury where I live or the immediate outskirts, or back home on the res in Wasauksing, and just, you know, be present with, you know, the trees and rocks and water and all that. So yeah, it's huge, and you know, it's what I know the best. And you know, on that token, like this community, I've placed them in far northern Ontario, right? Where I'm not from, you know, like imagine sort of like the James Bay lowlands, right? So, you know, I was able to consult with friends who are from that area to really try to get that part done properly and respectfully, you know, like I hired them to be expert readers in that sense. And I think that's really an essential part of the process for any writer too. You know, if there's something that you're not familiar with and you need an expert set of eyes to pay people to be that for you, you know, especially like living in far northern Ontario, like where I grew up is not remote by any stretch of the imagination. It's right beside Parry Sound and 2 hours north of Toronto, you know? So, but yeah, in that sense, like it's underlying that all is just a respect and a reverence for the land, and just understanding my place on it and with it, and that coexistence that needs to happen for sure. And yeah, those are the themes I wanted to get to in the second book, especially.
My question is a little bit tenuous, and it's neither a criticism nor am I expecting you to speak for everybody, but you, Duncan McHugh, Angela Starrett locally, have all left CBC specifically, but you know, broadcasting recently. And I sort of feel like as a first generation Canadian, my parents came from Britain in 52. I'm missing the First Nations voices that I experienced through you three and others, of course. What do you see as the continuation of the sort of work that you three had done and others in your places? Where does it go from here? You know, I realize this is outside the book, but
that's okay.
You're as much of an expert on it as anybody else, I would imagine. So I just like to hear your thoughts.
Well, thanks for raising that. You know, I can't speak for the others, my friends there. I would say for myself, you know, I had a great career at CBC. I had many good opportunities. I you know, learned so much about life and, you know, the land and the people here. And I guess very basically, it was just a good opportunity to pursue another dream, you know? And I was very fortunate with how things came together in sort of pushing me off the mothership, as we call it, right? The CBC mothership. But, you know, there is like, you know, I don't really see it as like a void that like Duncan and Connie and Angela leave, because they're doing so much important work otherwise, you know. Duncan especially is a journalism teacher now, right? So he's empowering the next generation and educating the next generation, whether they're Indigenous or not, about how to do Indigenous stories properly. And like when I went to journalism school, I was the only Native kid in the whole program from the res, right? So there was like educating that I had to do of my peers before I had to do my assignments or anything like that. So like those systemic issues really add up and they can get really frustrating. And that's, yeah, to be honest, one of the reasons why I left too, because it's like, well, I'd rather work for myself and not have to deal with any shit like that, you know? So I only have to deal with myself, right? And my self-employed self. But you know, like I've been away from CBC for 3.5 years, so I don't know everything that's going on internally there, but I do see a lot of my friends. I was just out with 3 former colleagues last night, so I'm never too far away from CBC either. But I know that they're working really hard to ensure that, you know, stories are done properly and that Indigenous people are represented in the newsroom more effectively as well. But I think, you know, what they need to hear is from the public and how the public values stories from Indigenous communities. You know, they need that criticism, they need that feedback to show that they're on the right track, and that, you know, that's what people want. That's what Canadians want at this point. So yeah, it's an ongoing thing for sure. And, you know, the media landscape is changing a lot. There's a lot of hostility towards the media in many ways. Like I think for the most part undeserved, in my opinion. It's really disheartening to see what a lot of my friends and former colleagues have to go through because of the quote unquote discourse around media and all that these days. But yeah, I would say just keep trying to support Indigenous journalists in whatever capacity they're working, right? Because what they're doing is really getting to the essence of the truth of this country and smashing the mythology of what Canada has been since its inception, right? It's all been a myth, and what Indigenous journalists are doing now is exposing that, rightfully, because we're all hopeful for the next generation, and we want to see them grow up in a better informed society. A better informed Canada.
Well, we've been friends on Facebook for a while, and we met a few years ago too. And I have to say that when I saw that shift, when you were leaving journalism to go into being a full-time author, I was overjoyed. But that's my own personal bias.
Thanks, Darrel.
Ani Wab.
Ani.
I knew Wab's father on my wrestling team.
He was my homeroom teacher when I was in grade 13. Yeah.
Good job there.
I didn't recognize you right away without the glasses. So.
Well, I used to have hair. Well, my question has to do with reconciliation. And there are so many things that need to be done. And if you were to prioritize them, what would you put number 1, 2, 3, whatever? Like that?
I would put language number one. The federal government is responsible for destroying Indigenous languages, so it should be fully responsible for restoring them. I think any person of any age has the right and should be fully funded to learn their language fluently. And until that happens, in my opinion, I think reconciliation is largely a ruse, because if you don't have the language, then how much identity is there, right? Like ceremony and culture, of course, are hugely important. But if we're just doing our ceremonies and, telling our stories in English or French, then what has been reconciled? I don't know, right? So, I think it needs to be language restoration at the very top. And, once that happens, there'll be a better sense of empowerment and identity, and that will hopefully offset some of the, I guess, more negative aspects of living in, a colonial world, right? Like in all the, hardships that come with that, all the despair and violence and brutality that still exists, right? It has to be language, in my opinion. But I'm no expert on reconciliation. I don't know what happens next, but I think you'd probably agree language is essential too, right?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for that. Really appreciate that. Great to see you here in Vancouver.
I think that's an excellent note to wrap up the Q&A session. I'm sure we could all listen to you both talk for days and days, but we all do have to go to bed sometime. But first, let's thank these two for an absolutely beautiful discussion tonight.
Thank you.
And there's a couple other folks I'd like to thank. I'd like to thank Carolyn Roberts for that absolutely beautiful welcome tonight as well. As well as our friends from Still Interpreting for making our events more accessible.
You wish.
And also the folks who co-sponsored this event. So Iron Dog Books, where I'm from, Penguin Random House, Real Vancouver Writers Series, and Vancouver Writers Fest. And this event wouldn't be possible without any of them. Have a beautiful rest of your night, and thank you all for coming tonight.
You wish. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.